The drive had been smooth for most of the day. Emily and her friends, Jake, Clara, and Sam, had spent the weekend camping deep in the Appalachians. It was a much-needed break from the chaos of their daily lives, but now they were eager to return home. They laughed and talked about the trip, passing snacks around the car as they navigated the winding mountain roads. The GPS signal faltered, then vanished entirely. Emily, who was driving, frowned at the screen. "We must have hit a dead zone," she said, glancing at Jake, the self-appointed navigator, in the passenger seat. "No worries," Jake said, tapping at the useless device. "Just keep heading straight. It'll come back." But as the hours dragged on, the scenery became unsettling. The thick forest loomed on either side of the narrow road, shadows stretching like claws across the pavement as the sun dipped lower in the sky. There were no road signs, no gas stations, and certainly no other cars. It was as if they'd left the world behind. "We should have hit the highway by now," Clara said, her voice tinged with unease. "This doesn't feel right." Jake pointed to a dirt road branching off to the left. "Maybe that's a shortcut. It looks like it heads back toward civilization." Emily hesitated but turned onto the road. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as they bumped along, and the forest grew denser. Trees arched overhead, their gnarled branches tangling like veins. The car's headlights flickered, struggling against the encroaching darkness. Then they saw it. A dilapidated sign half swallowed by weeds. Raven Hollow, 3 miles. It wasn't on any of their maps, but desperation to find their way back pushed them forward. The dirt road twisted and turned, narrowing with each mile until it barely accommodated the car. Sam leaned forward from the back seat. "Guys, maybe we should turn around. This doesn't feel right." Just as Emily considered reversing, the headlights caught movement up ahead. A man was standing in the middle of the road. He was gaunt and pale, wearing clothes that hung from his frame like they belonged to someone else. His eyes reflected the light unnaturally, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach them. Emily slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop mere feet from the man. For a moment, no one moved. "Do not get out," Clara whispered, clutching Jake's arm. The man stepped closer, his expression never wavering. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees. The group sat in stunned silence before Jake broke it. "That was creepy. Let's just back up and get out of here." Emily put the car in reverse, but the tires spun uselessly in place. She cursed and tried again. Nothing. It was as if the car was stuck in invisible mud. "Great," Sam muttered, peering out the back window. "This just keeps getting better." Then came the sound, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. It grew louder, closer, a scraping, dragging noise that echoed through the forest. Jake rolled down his window and the sound became deafening. "What is that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. The answer came in the form of a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a woman, her dress tattered and caked with dirt. Her hair hung in clumps, and her face was wrong. Her eyes were black pits, her jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. She stumbled toward the car, dragging a rusted chain behind her. "Drive!" Jake yelled. Emily stomped on the gas, but the car refused to move. The woman's head snapped toward them, and she let out a guttural scream that sent a shiver through every bone in their bodies. The group screamed as she slammed a hand onto the hood of the car. And then, just as suddenly, she was gone. The night was silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. Emily tried the engine one last time, and this time it roared to life. Without hesitation, she floored it, the car jolting forward down the road. But as they sped away, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The road twisted unnaturally, looping back on itself. No matter how far they drove, they couldn't escape. Hours later, as dawn broke, they found themselves back at the sign. Raven Hollow, 3 miles. The car sputtered and died, and the rustling in the trees began again.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a quick drive through the back roads to save time. Daniel had driven the route dozens of times before, and while it wasn't the most direct, it shaved 20 minutes off the trip to his mother's house. This time, though, something felt off. The weather didn't help. Thick fog clung to the ground, snaking its way through the skeletal trees that lined the deserted road. The headlights seemed to vanish into the mist, leaving the world outside the car a smothering, oppressive gray. Daniel adjusted the radio to break the silence, but all he got was static. The road stretched on endlessly, and the GPS flickered before going blank. Daniel cursed under his breath. This wasn't the first time the signal had dropped in the area, but tonight it felt different. He hadn't seen another car for miles, and the familiar landmarks, rusted mile markers, the old bridge, even the ancient oak with its twisted branches were nowhere to be found. As he strained to make sense of the road ahead, something darted across his path. Daniel slammed on the brakes, tires squealing against the asphalt. His heart pounded as he stared into the fog, his breath clouding the windshield. It had been quick, too quick, but he swore it was a person. He rolled down the window and leaned out. "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice echoed back, swallowed by the fog. Silence. No response, just the low hum of the engine and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Shaking it off, Daniel pressed on, but the unease gnawed at him. He turned a corner and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road. It was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging in front of her face. She wore a white dress that clung to her body as if it were soaked through, and her bare feet were planted firmly on the pavement. Daniel honked the horn. "Hey, move!" The woman didn't react. Instead, her head tilted slightly, and she raised an arm pointing directly at him. He felt a chill run down his spine. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. Before he could think, she dropped her arm and began walking toward the car, each step slow and deliberate. Panicking, Daniel reversed, the car lurching backward. The woman broke into a run. Her face became clearer in the headlights, pale and expressionless, but her eyes were black voids, reflecting nothing but the endless emptiness of the fog. Daniel floored the gas, swerving around her and speeding down the road. His pulse thundered in his ears as he checked the rearview mirror. She was gone, or so he thought. The faint sound of breathing came from the back seat. His heart seized. He didn't dare look, but he could feel it. Something was in the car with him. The breathing grew louder, raspier, and then a low, guttural voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come this way." Daniel screamed and spun the wheel, the car veering off the road and into the ditch. The impact was jarring, the airbag exploding in his face. When he opened his eyes, the world was silent again. Pain radiated through his chest, but he was alive. He stumbled out of the car, gasping for air. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the surrounding forest. He looked back at the car. It was empty. The back seat was bare, just as it should have been. But then he saw her. The woman was standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. Her face was clearer now, and the thing he had mistaken for hair wasn't hair at all. It was a mass of writhing black tendrils shifting and coiling like snakes. Before he could react, she opened her mouth and let out an inhuman scream. The sound pierced his ears, forcing him to his knees. When he looked up, she was gone again. Daniel ran. He didn't care where he was going. He just needed to get away. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as he stumbled through the underbrush. His legs burned, and his lungs felt like they would burst, but he didn't stop until he saw a faint light ahead. A cabin. Old and decrepit, but it was something. He pounded on the door, screaming for help. When it creaked open, he stumbled inside and slammed it shut behind him. The interior was sparse, a single room with a table, a chair, and a flickering oil lamp. A fireplace crackled weakly in the corner. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch his breath. Then he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but soon it became overwhelming, the metallic tang of blood. He turned toward the table and saw it. A pile of clothes, shredded and stained crimson, sat neatly folded. Beneath them was a stack of Polaroid photographs. He picked up the top photo with trembling hands. It was a picture of him sitting in his car, taken just minutes before he had crashed. The door behind him creaked open, and he wasn't alone anymore.
Story number 3.
The town of Ashford had always been quiet, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children played in the streets until dusk. But there was one road that no one dared to take after dark. Willow's Edge. Everyone in town had heard the stories, passed down from generation to generation, about the screaming man who haunted the narrow, overgrown path. Some said he was the ghost of a lost traveler. Others swore he was something much darker. Rachel didn't believe in ghost stories. As a city girl stuck in Ashford for the summer, she found the locals' superstitions quaint, even amusing. So when her cousin dared her to drive down Willow's Edge alone at night, Rachel didn't hesitate. The night was crisp and cool, the moon a faint sliver in the sky. Rachel drove her uncle's old pickup, the engine grumbling as it navigated the uneven road. The trees grew thicker as she went, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blotted out what little moonlight there was. Her high beams barely pierced the oppressive darkness. The road seemed endless, winding deeper into the woods. She tried to shake the unease creeping up her spine, chalking it up to her cousin's silly warning. But then she noticed something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Rachel slowed the truck, squinting into the gloom. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in tattered clothes. His face was obscured, his head hanging at an odd angle. He didn't move as the truck approached. She rolled down the window slightly, her heart pounding. "Hey, are you okay?" she called. The man's head snapped up, revealing a face that wasn't quite human. His eyes were deep, empty sockets, and his mouth stretched impossibly wide, locked in a silent scream. Rachel gasped and threw the truck into reverse, her tires skidding on the gravel. The man didn't follow. Instead, he vanished, one moment there, the next gone. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps as she sped backward, her hands trembling on the wheel. Just as she thought she was safe, the truck jolted violently, as if she had hit something. She slammed on the brakes and turned to look. There was nothing there. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her in suffocating silence. Rachel fumbled for her phone, but the screen was black. She cursed, slamming it against the dashboard. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. They were slow, deliberate, coming closer. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. She scanned the darkness outside, but the footsteps continued, circling the truck. Her eyes darted from one side to the other, but the figure remained hidden. Then the tapping began. Light, rhythmic taps on the driver's side window. She whipped her head around, but nothing was there. The tapping moved to the passenger side, then to the rear window. It was everywhere at once, mocking her. "Stop it!" she screamed, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. The sound ceased abruptly. For a moment, all was still. Then a voice whispered, low and guttural, right in her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Rachel screamed and scrambled out of the truck, running blindly into the woods. The branches clawed at her skin as she tore through the undergrowth, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. Something was chasing her. A shrill, piercing scream echoed through the forest, so loud and unnatural that it made her stumble and fall. She covered her ears, the sound drilling into her skull. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she had ever heard before. When the scream finally stopped, Rachel dared to look up. The forest was silent, the air heavy and still. She was completely alone, or so she thought. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the man's face, those empty sockets and that grotesque unending scream as he loomed over her, his hands outstretched. Rachel was never found. The next morning, her uncle's truck was discovered on Willow's Edge, the engine dead and the doors wide open. On the dusty windshield, scrawled in perfect, jagged letters, was a single word: run. From that day on, no one dared to go near Willow's Edge, not even the daylight.
Story number 4.
The old shortcut through Devil's Gorge had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a string of unexplained disappearances. Locals whispered about shadows that moved on their own, phantom voices calling from the cliffs, and headlights that flickered out, leaving drivers stranded in the cold dark. Most avoided it at all costs, but not everyone heeded the warnings. Maggie was running late, her night shift at the diner dragging longer than usual. She had no choice but to take Devil's Gorge if she wanted to make it to her son's school recital on time. The main highway was a good 40 minutes longer, and her beat-up sedan didn't have much gas left. The entrance to the gorge was marked by a rusted sign barely visible in the glow of her headlights. Road closed. Below it, someone had scrawled in red spray paint, "Turn back." Maggie rolled her eyes. "Superstitious nonsense," she muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She eased the car forward, her tires crunching over the gravel. The gorge was suffocatingly narrow, the jagged cliffs rising on either side like the walls of a prison. The road was uneven, riddled with potholes and cracks. Her headlights flickered slightly, but she dismissed it as the car's age catching up with it. About 10 minutes in, the radio began to crackle. Static hissed from the speakers, though she hadn't touched the dial. She reached to turn it off, but a voice came through the noise. "Help me," it whispered, faint and distorted. Maggie froze, her hand hovering over the knob. The voice was faint, but unmistakably desperate. She turned the radio off, her skin prickling. Then it came again, this time from outside the car. "Help me." She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. The voice was coming from the side of the road. Maggie squinted into the darkness and saw a figure slumped against the rocks. It was a man, his clothes torn and bloodied. He was barely moving, one arm raised weakly in her direction. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay in the car, Maggie opened the door. "Are you okay? What happened?" she called, stepping cautiously toward him. The man's head snapped up and Maggie's blood ran cold. His face was wrong, contorted and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin as he whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Before she could react, the man lunged. Maggie stumbled back, barely managing to scramble into the car and slam the door. He hit the window with a sickening thud, his face pressed against the glass, grinning that horrible grin. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but his eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, burned into hers. She floored the gas. The car screeched forward, and the man fell away, disappearing into the rearview mirror. Maggie didn't dare look back. The road twisted and turned, the cliffs seeming to close in tighter. Her headlights flickered again, dimming until they were barely illuminating the road. A cold dread settled over her as she realized something was following her. In the rearview mirror, shadows danced. They weren't from the cliffs or the car. They were alive, moving unnaturally fast, keeping pace with her. Her foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine groaning in protest. Then the car died. The headlights blinked out, the engine sputtered, and the car coasted to a stop. Maggie sat frozen, gripping the wheel as silence enveloped her. Her breath fogged the windshield, and the shadows gathered around the car, circling like predators. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Help me." It was behind her. She dared a glance into the rearview mirror and screamed. The man was sitting in the back seat, his grin wider than ever, his hollow eyes locked on hers. Maggie bolted from the car, running blindly down the road. The shadows followed, their whispering voices growing louder, overlapping into a maddening cacophony. She didn't stop until she reached the end of the gorge, where the trees opened up to a barren stretch of highway. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, the whispers finally fading. Her car was never found. Weeks later, a passing trucker reported seeing a woman standing at the edge of Devil's Gorge. She was pale, her clothes torn, her face blank. She didn't move as he passed, just raised one hand in a weak, desperate gesture. "Help me."
Story number 5.
The old Route 89 was a relic of the past, a forgotten road that wound through miles of desolate forest. No one used it anymore, not since the Gray Hollow incident 20 years ago. The story went that a school bus full of children had vanished without a trace on that stretch of highway, leaving behind nothing but eerie tire tracks that led into the woods and ended abruptly. Locals said the forest had swallowed them whole. Others whispered about a curse. Daniel and his girlfriend Lisa didn't believe in curses. They were road tripping across the country, looking for adventure. When their GPS lost signal and the car's tank hit empty, the only road they could take was Route 89. "It's just an old road," Daniel said, trying to reassure Lisa as he turned onto the cracked, overgrown asphalt. "We'll find a gas station soon." The road was eerily quiet. No streetlights, no signs, no other cars. Just the dense, dark forest pressing in from both sides. The headlights barely pierced the thick fog that had started to settle. Lisa shivered in the passenger seat, her eyes darting to the trees. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Daniel rolled his eyes but kept his thoughts to himself. The road seemed endless, stretching on with no landmarks, no intersections, just the same suffocating darkness. He checked his watch. They had been driving for an hour, but it felt like much longer. Then they saw it. A faint light flickered ahead, hazy and unnatural. It grew brighter as they approached, revealing an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been operational in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the paint on the sign, "Hollow Gas and Service," was peeling. But the pump lights were on, glowing faintly in the mist. Daniel pulled in and stopped the car. "I'll check it out." "Are you serious?" Lisa hissed, gripping his arm. "This place is giving me bad vibes." He forced a smile. "We don't have a choice. Just stay here." The air was heavy and damp as Daniel stepped out of the car. He approached the pump, but there was no handle, just an empty slot where it had once been. A faint metallic smell hung in the air, making his stomach churn. Then he noticed the footprints. They led from the pump to the woods, a set of small, childlike prints pressed into the dirt. They were barefoot. Daniel shivered and turned back to the car. Lisa, there's nothing. She wasn't in the car. Lisa, he called, panic rising in his chest. He ran to the other side, but the car was empty. The passenger door hung open, her purse still on the seat. Lisa, he yelled, his voice echoing into the void. A faint giggle echoed from the trees. Daniel froze, his blood turning to ice. It was soft and childlike, but there was something off about it, something hollow. Lisa, stop messing around, he shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and headed toward the trees, following the sound. The forest swallowed him whole. The deeper he went, the darker it became, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes that loomed over him. The giggling grew louder, coming from all directions. Then he saw her. Lisa was standing in a small clearing, her back to him. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, her hair obscuring her face. She didn't move, didn't react to his frantic shouts. Lisa, let's go. Daniel approached her cautiously, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but the moment he made contact, she turned. Her face wasn't Lisa's. Her eyes were sunken voids, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched too far, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. You found us, she whispered, her voice layered with countless others. Daniel stumbled back, tripping over a root. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw them, dozens of children standing behind Lisa, their hollow eyes watching him. Some had missing limbs, others had faces frozen in silent screams, but all of them were smiling. The flashlight went out. The last thing Daniel heard was their laughter, growing louder and louder until it consumed him. The next morning, a truck driver spotted Daniel's car abandoned on Route 89. The doors were open, the engine dead, and there were small, barefoot prints leading from the car into the woods. No one ever found him, or Lisa. But on foggy nights, drivers on Route 89 claimed to hear laughter drifting through the trees, faint and childlike, calling them to join the lost.
Story number 6.
It was a quiet night in the countryside, the kind where the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Hannah was driving home from a late shift, the hum of her car the only company on the desolate road. The route she chose was a shortcut, a little-used dirt road through the forest that cut 30 minutes off her commute. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, lighting up the dark interior of the car. It was a text from her sister. You home yet? Be careful. Heard weird stories about that road. Hannah chuckled and typed back at a red light. Just stories. I'll be fine. Almost there. She put the phone away and continued down the road. The trees on either side seemed to close in as the headlights illuminated their gnarled branches, which twisted and intertwined overhead, forming an eerie tunnel. She adjusted the radio for some background noise, but all she got was static. The first sign that something was wrong came when she realized she had been driving for much longer than usual. The road stretched endlessly ahead with no familiar landmarks in sight. Her GPS showed nothing but a blank screen, and her phone had lost service. Hannah's unease grew as she slowed the car, trying to get her bearings. That's when she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the road, illuminated by her high beams. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned suit. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but his posture was unnervingly still, almost like a statue. She rolled down her window slightly. Hey, do you need help? The man didn't respond. He raised one hand, pointing down the road, his movements slow and deliberate. Hannah's stomach tightened. There was something unnatural about the way he stood, the way he moved. She decided to keep driving, her foot pressing the gas pedal a little harder. As she passed him, her headlights briefly illuminated his face. Her breath caught in her throat. His features were sharp and gaunt, but his eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to absorb the light. Her heart pounded as she sped down the road, not daring to look back. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone anymore. The engine sputtered. The headlights flickered. The car slowed to a halt, despite her desperate attempts to restart it. She cursed under her breath, stepping out into the cold night air. The forest was silent, too silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. Hannah grabbed her flashlight and popped the hood, pretending she knew what she was looking for. Then she heard it, a faint whispering, like wind through the trees, but with words she couldn't quite make out. She swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Her pulse quickened as she backed toward the car. That's when she saw them, Figures emerged from the forest, their shapes barely visible in the weak moonlight. Men, women, children, all with hollow, empty eyes and twisted smiles that stretched too far. They moved silently, their feet not touching the ground. Hannah stumbled into the car, locking the doors. Her hands trembled as she tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The figures surrounded the vehicle, their faces pressed against the windows. Their smiles widened, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. They began to whisper again, their voices filling the car, growing louder and louder until they became a deafening roar. Hannah covered her ears, screaming for it to stop. And then, silence. When she opened her eyes, the figures were gone. The car started without issue, the engine purring as if nothing had happened. She sped down the road, not stopping until she reached her driveway. Hannah stumbled into her house, locking every door and window. She tried to convince herself it was just exhaustion, just her imagination. But when she checked her phone, her blood ran cold. A single photo was saved in her gallery, time-stamped from earlier that night. It was her car on the dirt road, surrounded by grinning figures. And in the driver's seat, she wasn't alone. A tall man in an old-fashioned suit and a wide-brimmed hat sat beside her, staring straight at the camera.
Story number 7.
There was a house on the edge of town that everyone knew but no one talked about. It was a decrepit, sagging structure that seemed to lean against the weight of time, with windows that stared out like empty, accusing eyes. Locals called it the Echo House, and the stories about it were all the same. Once you stepped inside, you never came out the same, or at all. Ellie had heard the stories growing up, but she didn't believe them. Urban legends, she thought. Silly tales to scare kids. So when her college friends dared her to spend one night in the Echo House, she laughed and agreed. Armed with nothing but her phone, a flashlight, and a sleeping bag, she entered just before sunset. The air inside the house was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and cobwebs draped the corners like forgotten shrouds. Ellie shivered, though it wasn't cold. There was a sense of wrongness to the place. A subtle hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. She set up her sleeping bag in the living room, its wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. As darkness fell, she began recording herself on her phone, talking about the challenge and laughing nervously to her non-existent audience. "Nothing's happening," she said, shining her flashlight around the room. "This is just an old, creepy house. Nothing, too." A loud thud came from upstairs. Ellie froze, her flashlight jerking toward the ceiling. She waited, holding her breath. Nothing, just silence. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But her voice wavered, and she felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. She decided to investigate, her footsteps hesitant as she climbed the creaking staircase. The upstairs hallway was worse, narrow, suffocating, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward. Her flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath, tapping it to stay on. The thud came again, this time from the room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness. Ellie's heart pounded as she approached. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, just an old bedroom with a rotted mattress and a broken dresser. But the air was colder here, and her flashlight dimmed again, the beam faltering. She stepped inside, her breath visible in the icy chill. On the wall, scratched into the peeling paint, were 3 words: "Leave. Now. Run." Her stomach twisted as she stumbled back. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into total darkness. She screamed, pounding on the wood, but it wouldn't budge. Then she heard it. A voice. No voices, whispering in unison. A chorus of hisses that seemed to come from every corner of the room. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was hungry, accusing. Ellie fumbled for her phone, its screen casting a faint glow. The whispers stopped abruptly, and then, in the light of her phone's camera, she saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, pressed against the walls, their features warped and hollow. They were watching her, their eyes glinting with malice. One of the faces began to move, stretching and pulling away from the wall, its mouth opening impossibly wide. Ellie bolted. The door flew open as she ran, the hallway stretching and warping before her eyes. She stumbled down the stairs, tripping and falling onto the splintered floor. The whispers returned, louder now, chasing her, surrounding her. She reached the front door and yanked it open, throwing herself into the night. She didn't stop running until she was back in her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. When she looked up, the house loomed in her rearview mirror. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something standing in the doorway, something tall and impossibly thin with glowing eyes. Ellie drove home in silence, too terrified to even cry. She swore she would never speak of the Echo House again. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a whisper from inside her room.